What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto forced to return to Konoha by Team 7? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto woke up when someone entered his room. The height of the too bright sun that peeked through the window shades indicated mid-afternoon. He felt like someone had run him over with a truck. Namikaze Naruto. The voice was cool and precise. Naruto recognized it, but didn't say anything. He moved a little and frowned as his elbow came into contact with another body, warm and curvy and still asleep. Fuck, he muttered. Apparently last night had gotten a little out of hand. He didn't even remember when he'd acquired the bedmate. Namikaze Naruto. I am here to escort you back to your village. His visitor might as well have been talking to a wall. Naruto had no desire to be awake. He turned over on his stomach and mashed his pillow over his head in an attempt to block out all auditory and visual stimuli. I have been instructed to use force if you do not comply, his visitor continued, with infuriating calmness. One bleary eye regarded the wolf-masked Anbu from underneath the pillow. I'm not going anywhere. Tell that bastard that he can go to hell, came the eloquent reply. If Naruto was baiting the Konoha nin, then it seemed to do the trick. Wolf ripped the pillow from Naruto and snarled, "That bastard is your father and the finest Hokage Konoha has ever seen." One hand rose in preparation to deliver a heavy cuff. The blow never landed. Suddenly Naruto was sitting upright, his hand capturing the Anbu's wrist in a powerful grip. For a minute, the room was silent, save for the sound of Wolf's heavy breathing. Then Naruto said, slowly, "Get out of my apartment." His voice was quiet, but his eyes had become very, very cold. There was suddenly something terrifying about him, a feeling of dangerousness that could hardly have been attributed to the blonde at first glance. As if there were something that stood behind him, some door that had been opened to reveal an ancient rage, terrible and patient. To his credit, the Anbu refused to be cowed. "Hokage-sama has ordered for you to be declared a missing nin unless you return with me to Konoha today." There was a creaking of bones as the grip on his wrist tightened, painfully. "You're bluffing." Underneath his mask, the Anbu wore a small smile of satisfaction. "Then kill me and find out." Naruto let go. All of the strength seemed to seep out of him as he collapsed onto his bed. The girl sleeping next to him stirred, moving the sheets to expose just enough to make the Anbu look away. Seeing this made Naruto smile wickedly. "She's not bad, if you want to go, Wolf-san." To be honest, he didn't know how she was at all. Last night was lost in a haze of booze and drugs. He was only saying it to get a rise out of the masked nin. "Get up." The disgust in the Anbu's voice made Naruto's smile widen. "All right, you got me, I'm going." Wolf waited impatiently as Naruto stretched prodigiously and padded into the bathroom to shower, as if this were any other morning or afternoon. The Anbu had little idea why the Hokage was recalling this delinquent now. If it had been up to Wolf, the little bastard could go on wasting his life to his heart's content, wallowing in every cesspool known to the elemental nations until he either ended up a homeless addict or died of an overdose. But blood ran deep, even bad blood. Wolf knew that better than anyone. Naruto's apartment had all the markings of a temporary home. There was no sign that an attempt had been made to make the place more habitable. The blonde had never really unpacked, his clothes lying in a pile over a black duffel bag. The kitchenette was devoid of any dishware or cutlery, although it boasted an excess of empty bowl ramen containers. Even the bed was barely more than a metal frame with a mattress, although the blonde had apparently sprung for some nice sheets, being the hedonist that he was. Speaking of hedonism, there was an empty handle of liquor on the ground next to the bed, and another lying half-empty alongside it. There were also a few crumpled squares of white paper next to them. Wolf had no illusions about what they had once contained. He supposed that he should make some attempt to rouse the girl and send her home before she woke up on her own to an abandoned apartment. But the sight of her only made him angry. She, along with the refuse that littered the floor, was the symbol of Naruto's wasted life, of his reprehensible choices and his disgusting excess. Many a time the Hokage had broken down in front of his most trusted ninja, both in fury and in desperation. No one had any idea where Naruto went wrong. He had been a happy child, polite and morally upright, until one day, when he just suddenly wasn't. It had been such a drastic change that the Hokage had suspected genjutsu, ordering Itachi, the scion of Konoha's infamous Uchiha clan, to personally take a look at the boy. Itachi had reported no externally derived abnormalities, but he had looked troubled after talking to Naruto, a rarity for the normally stoic Anbu. Then again, the next week Itachi had massacred most of his clan, so there was no telling what had been going on in the man's head. There was an abrupt sound as Naruto shut off the shower. A few minutes later, he stepped out of the bathroom, toweling off his hair and wearing only a pair of boxers. Sensing the frown underneath Wolf's mask, he smirked and said, "Like what you see?" "Pack," the Anbu barked. "And do something about your guest." Naruto tapped a cigarette out of its pack as he idly watched Wolf's exchange with the guard. After less than a minute, the guard gave a smart salute and shouted something at another nin stationed a little further down. Then the gates of Konoha opened with a loud groan. The blonde formed a quick succession of seals with his free hand and lit his cigarette with a snap of his fingers. He inhaled deeply, enjoying the subtle changes in Wolf's body language that signaled disapproval. "Let's go," the Anbu growled. "The Hokage wants to see you immediately." "What a pain," Naruto muttered. They had covered the distance to Konoha in just about 2 days. Wolf had set an exhausting pace, but Naruto, much to the ANBU's secret annoyance, had not suffered much from it. Despite everything, the blonde was a talented ninja, and his stamina outstripped that of most of his peers, Wolf included. The two walked to the Hokage's tower like civilians. Very few people along the way recognized Naruto, and no one chose to remark on the boy's return. The Hokage's son was a touchy subject in Konoha. "I don't see anyone I know," the blonde commented as they made their way through maze-like streets. "The rest of the rookie 9 are Chunin now," Wolf said. There was an acidic edge to his voice. "Except for Neji, who made Junin last year. Naturally, they are all kept very busy with missions. And poor me, still a lowly genin." There were 1,000 things that Wolf wanted to say in response to that. Instead, he kept silent as they approached the looming tower. The Anbu at the doors let them in without question. The Hokage was behind his desk, signing documents. Time had been kind to Namikaze Minato. The daily stresses of his position had done little to mar the youthfulness of his features. But as he looked up to see the Anbu escort Wolf and his son into his office, the lines on his face seemed to deepen, and the shadows under his eyes grew starker, until he seemed to wear the mask of an old man. Wolf noticed it, and inwardly seethed at the effect Naruto had on his father. "Hi there," the boy said offhandedly, as if he hadn't been 3 years missing. "Why did you have Kakashi call me back?" Wolf flinched at the identification, earning another of Naruto's wicked smiles. "You think I'm stupid enough to not recognize the voice of my own Junin-sensei?" Minato put down his pen and leaned back tiredly. He did not stand up. "Naruto, it's been a long time." The smile immediately vanished from his son's face, replaced by an angry glower. "You brought me back here as the Hokage," Naruto snapped. "Don't start talking to me as my father." "All right then," Minato conceded. They had already treaded this ground 3 years ago, again and again, and each time, fruitlessly. The older blonde's voice became cool and impassive, but his expression remained weary. "Naruto, I have ordered your return on behalf of Konoha and the council. The elemental countries are drawing closer to war, and your skills are needed here." The boy remained silent, but his anger did not dissipate. "I am reforming Team 7 under Hitaki Kakashi. You will report to him as your commander from today on." There was a sudden flare of wind-imbued chakra as Naruto exploded. "Team 7? I'd rather be declared a missing nin and hunted down like an animal than let them fuck with me again." The air lashed violently around them like a wild storm. It was an impressive display of elemental chakra, but the Hokage refused to be fazed. "Stone-faced," Minato said, "then that can be arranged." Kakashi looked away. He knew how much the older blonde suffered to utter those words. How had it come to this, that a father would need to say such a thing to his only child? Naruto narrowed his eyes. The wind around them sharpened. Kakashi felt its dangerous pressure against his skin and wondered why the Anbu hadn't come charging into the office yet. Minato said softly, "I will put you down myself if that is what it comes down to." At first Kakashi thought Naruto was going to attack his own father, but then the wind chakra let up and the boys slumped in defeat. When he looked back up, there was no acknowledgement of either of their presences in his eyes. It may as well have been the gaze of a dead thing. Mechanically, Naruto said, I will report to Hitaki-san tomorrow morning. I request permission to be dismissed. I am assigning Mouse and Eagle to keep watch over you, the Hokage said. Dismissed. I have no right to call myself a father, Minato said. Sometimes I wish that the Kyuubi had taken me along with it. Kakashi couldn't think of anything to say to that, so he said nothing. Where did you find him? The Hokage asked, rubbing his forehead tiredly with one hand. A small village near water country. Was he by himself? Yes, Kakashi lied smoothly. He had his own apartment. Did he seem all right to you? There was a dry twist to the blonde's voice. For the most part, he didn't seem very happy to be coming back here. Kakashi, Minato said suddenly. His expression was somber. I know my son, and his vices. You don't have to protect me from the truth. The silver-haired Junin licked his lips uncertainly. Then he pulled up his mask so that he could look his sensei in the eye. When I found Naruto, he was in bed with a girl that I don't think he knew. He had been drinking. And? Kakashi looked away. Minato-sensei. I want to hear it, Kakashi. The Junin said slowly, I think, that he's been using drugs. Minato sighed, long and drawn out. The sound of the life departing a dying body. What am I going to do? He's in no position to be serving actively, but I've put him in that spot. Fuck, I even threatened to kill him. My own son. Kakashi began, the council. Fuck the council, Minato snarled, surprising his former student with his viciousness. If it weren't for the sake of this village, I would happily see those bastards dead. Desperately, he said, I wish I could step down. But they both knew that he couldn't. That war was coming to Konoha, plain and simple, and that without the yellow flash to lead it, their village would not make it out of the pending conflict on top. And the Land of Fire had far more to lose than any of the other elemental countries. The fourth was the most talented ninja Konoha had ever produced. But here, in this expansive office with his only surviving student, he was a failure, a man who couldn't put the welfare of his only child before the demands of his job. Kakashi arrived at the training grounds to see Naruto idly leaning against the fence, smoking, while his two teammates stood next to each other, some distance away. The blonde looked up as he approached, flicking the ash from his cigarette. Mornin', Commander. Kakashi-sensei. The Junin winced at the high-pitched voice. Though Hinuro Sakura had matured, the pitch of her voice had not mellowed and it still had a way of grating on his nerves. Why is Naruto here? It was a valid question, and from the stares his two students were giving him, it was one that they expected an answer to. Kakashi sighed and glanced at the blonde in question. You want to tell them? The Hokage recalled me to active duty, Naruto said shortly. He reformed Team 7, so here I am, Kakashi-sensei. It was the normally taciturn Uchiha Sasuke. He has defected before. How do we know that we can trust him? Naruto favored him with a cold, twisted smile. The Hokage gave me a pretty clear choice, either join up with you guys, or be put down. He even offered to do the deed himself. Pretty considerate of him, considering how busy he is. Sasuke looked away in disgust. Kakashi felt a sudden throbbing at his temples. It was going to be a long morning. Naruto winced as he applied the cold compress to his face. The sparring exercises that morning had gotten a little out of hand and Sasuke's elbow had left its mark in the form of an ugly purpling under his left eye. Naruto wasn't concerned. The bruise wouldn't even be there the next morning, but in the meantime, it still hurt like hell, and it was a humiliating reminder of how out of shape he was. At least he had gotten the bastard back for it. The Namikaze estate was as quiet as he remembered. The house was devoid of other people, as Minato chose not to keep servants. Naruto hated it. Even a girlfriend who visited once in a while to break the silence would have been nice, but Minato had seldom dated after his wife's death. Kushina had left an irreplaceable void in his mind, one that he had tried to fill with his duties as the Hokage and, less successfully, with raising his son. Naruto had an entire wing of the main house to himself. When he returned, he'd found his rooms unchanged but coated with dust. A quick application of wind chakra had remedied that, but bitterly he found himself thinking that it was typical of Minato to ignore his absence in the same way that he ignored his presence. He no longer minded being alone. He still minded being lied to. Kakashi had suggested that they disband early after the particularly brutal morning. Since his father wouldn't be home until well into the evening, That meant Naruto had the entire rest of the day to himself to do fuck all. Or would have, if someone hadn't entered the estate grounds. Long ago, Minato had inscribed a series of seals onto the outer perimeter of their home. Anyone who stepped on them would trigger a pulse of chakra along the walls of the buildings that served as a warning for visitors, of both the friendly and not so friendly sort. Naruto stiffened as he felt such a pulse, and waited for a knock at the gate. When there was none, he went out to investigate. If the intruder was trying to be sneaky, then he failed entirely by neglecting to mask his killing intent. Naruto felt it shiver up his spine and immediately knew that someone was after him. The problem was locating the assassin. The Namikaze grounds were diligently attended to by a gardener who came by twice a week at the insistence of the council. It made the village look bad, they argued, if its leader's yard was not absolutely pristine. Minato had found the reasoning stupid, but rather than argue, he took his usual route of deferring to their judgment. As a consequence, the front yard was a perfectly sculpted Japanese garden, and that meant lots of places for a trained killer to hide. As he scanned the perimeter, Naruto found himself wondering where the two Anbu assigned to him were. There was no love lost between himself and the citizens of Konoha, but he'd thought that at least Konoha Nin would obey the goddamn word of his leader and in the guardianship of his only child. Apparently that had been too much to hope for. A shower of projectiles suddenly rained out of nowhere, and Naruto found himself cursing as he rolled away. He sent a pulse of wind chakra out to disturb his surroundings, and was rewarded by the brief glimpse of black fabric in a clump of shrubs. Swiftly, he formed a succession of hand seals and sent a more powerful Fuuten jutsu in that direction, forcing the assassin to leap away. His attacker was male, masked, and dressed all in black. Distantly, Naruto found himself thinking that this was a poor choice for a daytime attack, but he didn't have a chance to dwell on the matter as his opponent sent another hail of kunai his way. He managed to avoid most of them, but one sliced him somewhat deeply in the shoulder. Disgusted at how rusty his skills had become, Naruto clamped a hand down on the wound and, after finding it to be not that serious, formed a longer sequence of seals with his free hand. The Kaiden blast caught his attacker full on and knocked him back into a tree. Before he could recover, Naruto was upon him, one hand pinning the assassin to the tree trunk by the neck, the other holding a kunai millimeters away from his face. The blonde casually sliced the mask from the man's face, revealing a pale countenance with dark hair and darker eyes. He had on a Konoha Hite ite, but Naruto did not recognize him. "So," Naruto said, almost conversationally, "why are you trying to kill me?" Graciously, the man spat in his face. Without so much as a flinch, Naruto wiped it off with the back of the hand holding the kunai and, just as impassively, gave the man's neck a little squeeze. His attacker only became more defiant. "I was doing my job as a Konoha citizen, calling a monster like you. You do know that I'm the son of the Hokage, right? The Yondaime is a great leader, but even he erred in marrying that witch." Stone-faced, Naruto broke his nose. He ignored the ensuing howls of pain and said, "Before I kill you, I just want to know, did someone send you, or did you act alone?" The man's pulse stayed steady under his hand as he replied spitefully, "I acted by myself. There are plenty more like me in this village." Catching sight of the blonde's expression, he added with a sneer, "But you already know that, don't you?" Naruto said nothing. He simply began to crush the man's throat. Small gurgling noises made their way out of his attacker's mouth. They were just starting to grow satisfying when the blonde felt the presences of two new ninjas arrive behind him. "Namikaze-san, we request that you hand the assassin to us." For questioning, it was Mouse who spoke. Naruto felt his expression twist in anger. "And where the hell were you two when this guy decided to attack me?" "My apologies, Namikaze-san. He had us entrapped us in a genjutsu." There was neither shame nor apology in the Anbu's tone. Naruto said darkly, "I am sure that's exactly what happened. You do not need to believe us." This time, it was Eagle who spoke, his voice crisp. "Still, we ask that you relinquish the assassin. It is imperative that we uncover his motivations for staging an attack at the Hokage's very residence." Naruto snarled in disgust, but withdrew his hand. "Fuck off then," was all that he said before he went back into the main house. "How is he?" Minato asked, his hand paused over the next stack of forms. Unlike his predecessor, he could never get the hang of filling out paperwork and talking at the same time. Sloppy, was Kakashi's answer. His reflexes have dulled. He let Sasuke get in a few hits that never would have landed 2 years ago. However, his skill with wind chakra has improved. Insanely. There was a wry smile on the Hokage's face as he said, I think I got a sense of that in person. Has he developed a secondary affinity yet? There was a slight hesitation, and then Kakashi said, yes, I saw him light a cigarette with a minor Kaden jutsu. Minato snorted. He didn't blast his face off, so that's a good sign of his control, at least. Hearing that his son had added smoking to his list of vices didn't surprise him in the least bit. Really, tobacco was rather low on the list of the things Naruto could be doing to shorten his life. How is the team getting along? Kakashi sighed. They don't trust him, and I can't blame them. You know what they say, once burned, twice shy. The Hokage nodded. Especially when it comes to my son. Sakura, did he ever? Not that I know of, Kakashi said. So at least, that's not the problem. The issue is that he left them, just when Team 7 was starting to come together. Naruto was always kind of the keystone of the group. He was helping Sakura get over her self-esteem problems, and I think he was the first real friend Sasuke had after the Uchiha massacre. They were devastated when he vanished. I thought they would see it coming, though. His behavior was becoming more and more erratic, and his mood swings worse and worse. Sakura went home crying a few times because of him, towards the end. Of all the people who should have seen it coming, I think I'm probably at the top of that list, the blonde said bitterly. After all the things I caught him doing, all the arguments we had. Minato-sensei. Anyway, can they still work together? Kakashi sighed. Their teamwork is as strong as I remember it being. Only instead of having Naruto watch their backs, Sasuke and Sakura prefer him to act as the diversion. A role he's quite suited for. I guess that's the best we can hope for, Minato said, half under his breath. I'm sending you on a mission to Suna. They've recently appointed a new case cage, but because of our relations, we know very little about him. Reconnaissance, high B rank. Take tomorrow to prepare, then depart immediately. There was a sudden knock on the door, then one of the Anbu guards poked his head into the office. Sorry, sir, Danzo-san is here to see you. Let him in, Minato said tiredly, not bothering to dismiss his former pupil. He already knew that Kakashi was silently gone. The blonde wished that he could leave just as easily. He never enjoyed talking with the elders, but for the most part they were simply another of the many undesirable trappings that came with the office. One-on-one sessions with Danzo, however, were an entirely different story. Most high-ranking Konoha nin knew better than to trust the Warhawk. Minato took it one step further. He deeply despised the man. Danzo was aware of how the Hokage hated him, and worse, the scarred veteran knew exactly why Minato would never be able to act upon that hatred. The amount of tension that built up during their meetings sometimes caused the Anbu to shrink away from the doors in fear. So Minato simply leaned back with his arms crossed as he watched Danzo enter the office. The Yondaime did not offer him a chair, partially out of petty spite, and partially because he knew Danzo would not take one. The elder did not sit, nor did he stand, he simply loomed over whatever he was addressing. Minato chalked it up as just one more thing he disliked about the man. Hokage-sama, trust Danzo to make an honorific sound like an insult. I heard that you have recalled your son. Yes, I had him brought back yesterday. We are worried about his mental state. The council gave the order for his return to duty in the first place. From their decision, I assumed that any concerns over Naruto's condition had been addressed. Danzo's mouth thinned into a cold line. Not to everyone's satisfaction. Minato fought the urge to smile. Normally Danzo was able to bully the elders into going along with him. Apparently the man didn't appreciate having his opinion overridden. If you will excuse my directness, Hokage-sama, but Naruto's past record has shown that he cannot be relied upon. To have put him on the same team as two promising young Konoha nin will be seen by some as a foolhardy move on your part. Kakashi is one of the most talented Junin this village has ever produced, and his students are just as capable, Minato replied dryly. They have worked together well with Naruto before. I have complete faith in Team 7's continued ability to excel. Your peers apparently agree with me, he added, enjoying how his words caused Danzo's scarred face to contort slightly. Twisting the knife further, he said, in recognition of your concerns, I can recommend that he be placed with a therapist. Selected by this office, of course. It took a few moments for the veteran to school his expression back into its normally impassive mask. Well, seeing that Hokage-sama has the situation under control, I asked to take my leave, he said finally, making for the door. Just as he was about to leave, he turned back to stare at Minato, unbridled malice in his single eye. In any event, I hope that, if circumstances arise for it, you will do what needs to be done for the good of Konoha. Minato froze at those words. He heard them echo in his head, repeated for every time they had been said to him, every time that he had failed their expectation. The door closed behind Danzo with a small creak of its hinges. In an uncharacteristic lapse of self-control, Minato seized one of his signature kunai and hurled it with all his strength. It gouged deeply and satisfyingly into the thick wooden panels, but Minato fervently wished that it had been the man itself. If only it were that easy. He felt the guilt that had become a constant in his life since the Kyuubi attack stir in his belly and forced it back down with a violence born from fear. Of all the people who could know what he had always suspected since that day, why did it have to be Danzo? Of all the people who could have such a hold over his pride and his shame, why the fuck did it have to be Danzo? It was Tenten's first time alone at the bar. Usually Neji and Lee would accompany her here after missions to unwind, but tonight Neji was occupied by Hyuga clan business and Lee had been immediately tapped upon their return for a task that required a taijutsu expert. Tenten was going to be damned if she stayed home with an empty apartment when everyone else seemed to doing something, so she put on something nice and went out. She wasn't sure what she'd had in mind. She sat at the bar and finished 2 cocktails, both delicious and accordingly expensive. She watched the groups of people who came in, sat down, and gleefully lost control of themselves. A few people sat next to her and tried to chat her up, but she wasn't interested and responded appropriately. The bartender gave her a 3rd drink on the house, which she was guilty of nursing a bit. Meanwhile, someone had once again filled the seat next to her. She observed him from the corner of her eye. It was hard not to look at him, because he stood out. Tall, tanned skin, lemon yellow hair. She didn't hear what he ordered, but the bartender seemed surprised by it. The bartender took out a tall bottle, half full of a clear, amber-colored spirit and poured a generous amount into a small glass. Then he laid a strange-looking, perforated spoon across the glass circumference and on top of that placed a single sugar cube. Tenten was both confused and fascinated by this strange preparation. She watched as the bartender took a frosted pitcher of water and dripped it slowly over the sugar cube and into the glass. The liquor in the glass began to pale in color and take on a cloudy appearance. When the volume in the glass had increased by about a third and the liquid inside was a milky white, the bartender removed the spoon and what was left of the sugar cube and gave the drink a quick stir. Then he handed it to the blonde, who took a long sip. "How is it?" the barkeep asked. "Really good. Vintage? Belonged to my grandfather, but no one in my family drinks the stuff. It won't put hair on your balls, but maybe it'll bring you some luck with that girl sitting next to you." Hearing this, Tenten flushed, but then the bartender smiled at her and she remembered that he had at least given her a free drink. In any event, she was feeling too mellowed to take further offense. The blonde smiled at her too and started a conversation. The topic was trivial, but he was funny and engaging. A little crazy. Tenten began to enjoy herself. He had another drink, then another. Tenten joined in for a round of shots. And then the blonde kept going, until she no longer cared to keep track. The strange thing was, as her companion grew more and more obviously inebriated, his eyes began to take on a disturbing clarity. It was almost as if some other entity were gazing through them and directly at her. Something wiser and much, much older. Tenten found herself looking away more often. Suddenly, he said, "So how is Guy doing?" And her hand immediately went to the kunai she had hidden at the small of her back, underneath her shirt. "Do I know you?" she asked cautiously, trying to concentrate through the blur of alcohol. "I'm hurt, Tenten. It's me, Naruto. From Team 7? Naruto. I thought you were away. Why the hell didn't you say something sooner?" He laughed sheepishly and rubbed the back of his head, a familiar gesture. "Actually, I just realized who you were. You've grown a lot, Tenten. Well, in my defense, so have you." Naruto grinned. "Fuck, Tenten. I was trying to pick you up. Your teammates would fucking cream me if they found out." Tenten found herself grinning back despite herself. Who says they had to find out? But Naruto wasn't paying attention to her anymore. He was staring at someone else, and there was furious expression on his face. Puzzled by who could have caused such an abrupt change in his mood, Tenten followed his gaze and saw a pale middle-aged man with dark hair and darker eyes, finishing off a pitcher of beer by himself in a corner of the bar. His skin was oddly discolored at his throat, as though it was bruised, but aside from that there was nothing obviously unusual about him that Tenten could see. Abruptly, Naruto excused himself to pay their tabs. Then he was out the door before she could even say goodbye. Kakashi found him on top of the Nidaim's monument. Naruto noticeably stiffened as the Junin approached. He was sitting cross-legged, smoking a cigarette, and watching the village go about its usual morning routine. His eyes were half-lidded and shadowed. He did not look like he had slept at all. "You were supposed to meet us an hour and a half ago," Kakashi said. I know, get moving or you'll send the hunter Nin out to cull me." Naruto stood up with a small groan, wobbling a little on his feet. Kakashi shot him a sharp glance, but the blonde waved it off. "Don't worry, I'm not high anymore. My legs are just stiff." The end of his cigarette flared to life as he took one last, long drag, then crushed it beneath his heel. For a minute, Kakashi said nothing. Then, "I've been asked by Amino-san to bring Team 7 to the academy for Meet a Ninja Day, or whatever it is." Naruto seemed to sense his Junin sensei's reluctance for introducing someone such as himself to young, developing minds and smiled lopsidedly in response. "You're probably better off leaving me here then, Kakashi-sensei." For once, there was no rancor in his voice as he addressed his teacher. Kakashi looked at him, surprised by the change in his tone. Finally, the Junin said, bluntly, "If I have to suffer through show and tell with academy brats, I'm going to drag anyone I can find down with me. Especially if it's you." His wayward student only chuckled in response as the two of them leapt down toward the village. "Can anyone tell me who the Hokage is?" A hand immediately shot up. It belonged to a girl with straw-colored hair and freckles, wearing an obnoxiously purple jumper. She was leaning so far forward over her desk that the back legs of her chair had lifted off the ground. Naruto turned and smirked at his teammate, who flushed the same shade as her hair and looked away. The resemblance was obvious. "Tomoyo-chan?" Iruka said kindly, inviting the girl to answer. She immediately obliged. Standing up with her hands clasped behind her back, she closed her eyes and recited diligently, "The Hokage is the highest-ranking ninja in Konoha. It is his job to lead and protect the village." "Very good, Tomoyo-chan," Iruka said. The redhead beamed and sat down. "Now, can anyone tell me about the current Hokage?" A dark-haired, pale-eyed boy, doubtlessly the Hyuga genius of their generation, stood up and answered this time. "The Yondaime is considered the best ninja that Konoha has ever produced. He is famous for his decisive role in the war with Iwa, where he defeated an entire army by himself. He also saved the village from the demon fox Kyubi by sealing it into an Inari statue. Since then, he has overseen one of the longest stretches of peace in Konoha history." "That's exactly right, Yosuke-kun," Iruka affirmed. "Now, today I have asked a Junin to bring his team to talk to you all. Class, this is Hitaki Kakashi and Team 7. Hinuro Sakura, Uchiha Sasuke, and Namikaze Naruto." "Whoa," some said at the back of the classroom, "is he really the Hokage's son?" Naruto forced himself to smile and said, "That's right, the Yondaime is my father." The class dissolved into a flurry of excited voices. It took a minute for Iruka to re-establish quiet. Then he said, "Let's ask Kakashi and his team what it's like to be an active Konoha nin." There was an awkward silence as each member of Team Kakashi waited for the others to speak first. Finally, the Junin said lamely, "Being a ninja is hard." 20 sets of eyes stared blankly at him. Someone in the back began to giggle. Sakura tried to salvage the situation. "What Kakashi-sensei means is that being a ninja involves a lot of difficult training. But anyone can be a good ninja, as long as they work hard at it." Again, silence followed. Then, someone shouted, "Show us a cool jutsu." Team 7 exchanged nervous glances. Finally, Sasuke formed a brief series of hand seals and blew a very small plume of fire out of his mouth. The flames flashed a dazzling cobalt for a brief moment before wisping out of existence. The class immediately broke out into shrieks of delight. "Does anyone have questions for Team Kakashi?" Iruka asked as soon as the excitement died down. wanting to head off any other demonstrations that could potentially destroy his classroom. A girl with brown hair tied up in pigtails raised her hand, and Iruka called on her. She stood up, stared accusingly at Naruto, and said, "My Ka-san told me that you're a very, very bad person. And that your Ka-san was a bad person too." She made the Kyuubi attack. Kakashi winced at the childish self-righteousness in her voice and quickly glanced at his most volatile student. Naruto's eyes glittered darkly and his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. But thankfully he seemed to be in control of himself. The Junin was just about to suggest that Sasuke show the class his Sharingan to defuse the situation when the classroom door opened and 4 Anbu stepped inside. Ignoring the academy students as well as the rest of Team 7, they quickly surrounded Naruto. "Namikaze-san, please come with us." The one who spoke was wearing an eagle mask. Kakashi recognized him as one of the guards Minato had assigned to watch over his son. Mouse was also present, but the other two wore unadorned masks and he didn't know them. They could not have come at a worse time. Naruto had been angry but unable to act upon it, but now a suitable target had arrived. Already a wicked grin was beginning to form on his face. If he left with the Anbu, there was no telling what he would do. What a pain, Kakashi thought. Abruptly, he stepped forward and said, as his immediate superior, "I'm coming along too." His blonde student shot him a murderous look, but the Junin shrugged it off. The class watched in complete silence as the Anbu led them away. Kakashi had seen plenty of corpses during his tenure as a Konoha nin. Some of them had been particularly gruesome, corpses rendered unrecognizable as human by forbidden jutsu. Corpses put up on display as a macabre warning to their living companions. Corpses left to fester on the forest floor weeks after the life in them had expired. But a corpse placed on a metal slab at the morgue lost much of its context. The Junin had a difficult time reminding himself that what was laid out before them had ever been alive. It was the body of a dark-haired male. He looked somewhat older than Kakashi, but it was difficult to tell. His neck was ringed with ugly purple bruises, but it was obvious that he did not die by strangulation. The corpse looked like it had been run through a food processor. Every visible portion of skin was riddled with lacerations. Some of the cuts were small, while others manifested as wide, angry slashes. There was no pattern to their dispersal or severity, as if the man had been attacked repeatedly by a blind guy with a machete. Or maybe a master of wind manipulation. "We found the corpse lying near the Hokage's tower earlier this morning," one of the unmarked Anbu said. "God, what an idiotic place for someone to hide a body," Naruto said caustically. "Are you going to arrest me now, or are we going to stand some more in a room with a dead guy? Would you care to explain why you killed him? I was doing your job for you. Last I thought, attacking the Hokage's family was considered an act of treachery and a capital offense. Or did you forget that he tried to kill me yesterday? He was a civilian," Eagle said evenly. "They are not subject to military justice. We had no choice but to release him." Naruto laughed derisively. "You are all such fucking awful liars." Before anyone could stop him, the blonde tilted the corpse's head up and pried open its jaw to show them a series of thick black markings that started at the back of the tongue and extended down into the dead man's throat. It looked as if a colony of termites had crawled into the man's mouth and taken up residence. Kakashi wondered that, if he were to look at Mouse and Eagle's tongues, he would find the same thing. If the Anbu were surprised by the curse seal, they did not show it. "The elders want to see you," Mouse said abruptly. "We shouldn't keep them waiting." Naruto was led out of the room in disgust. He had no doubt in his mind which elder he was going to be seeing. Much to Naruto's surprise, all 3 elders were present when he was escorted inside the room by the Anbu. It was a classic interrogation chamber, framed by thick stone walls on 3 sides and a tinted, one-way window on the 4th. The blonde was led to one end of a thick wooden table, opposite Mitokado, Utatane, and Danzo. Mouse and Eagle were there also, each guarding one of the corners by the elder's side. As Naruto seated himself, Danzo stared the blonde with his one good eye, flat and dead like a shark's. His 2 colleagues, seated on either side of him, maintained impassively blank expressions and looked for all the world like motionless mannequins, waiting for a command from their puppet master. Well, Naruto, never able to bear complete silence for too long, was the first to speak. "Here I am again." His offhand demeanor did not amuse anyone. "Namikaze Naruto," Utatane said sternly, How long have you been back in Konoha? The day before yesterday. And in that time, how many of our laws have you broken? Naruto blinked innocently. None that I'm aware of. Mitokado Homura snorted. Try 4. Disobeying a direct superior, using a controlled substance, patronizing a prostitute, not to mention, killing a civilian. Naruto whistled admiringly, then said venomously to the two Anbu, "Wow, you guys get around. I don't even remember getting with the hooker. Was she any good?" Namikaze. Utatane snapped, her voice tight with anger. "I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. Murdering a civilian violates the unspoken agreement we Konoha nin have with the villagers. They will be demanding your blood for this." "What else is new?" Naruto said dismissively. "If that man was a civilian, then I'm a fucking virgin." He leaned forward and rested his elbows against the table. For lack of anything better to do and to annoy Danzo, he drummed his fingers a little against the table. "Hey, do you mind if I smoke?" "Keep your filthy habits to yourself," Mitokado immediately growled. "I simple, no, would do," the blonde retorted peevishly, slouching back in his chair. "Your father seems to think that having you back on duty will somehow help our chances if war breaks out." This time, it was Danzo who spoke, and his voice contained a not-so-subtle undercurrent of malice. "I think that you are a loose cannon, more of a danger and a detriment to Konoha than an asset. Your recent actions have only further confirmed this." Naruto smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Finally, the man was getting to the point. "Is that why you tried to have me killed?" Danzo sneered. "You think I am somehow connected to the victim? A mere civilian, with no training in the ninja arts whatsoever?" "I don't know," the blonde replied conversationally. "He seemed to have the curse seal that you're so fond of putting on all of your lackeys." Before Danzo had a chance to retaliate, a knock sounded at the door. One of the Anbu went and opened it, his body blocking the intruder from sight. Words were exchanged, then the Anbu stepped back from the door to let Nara Shikamaru into the room. "What's this?" Mitokado said, rising from his seat. "This is a closed meeting. No one else is allowed in here, shinobi or otherwise." "Sorry sir," Shikamaru said, but his lazy tone made him sound anything but repentant. "The Hokage sent me, actually, to deliver Yasu Takashi's files." In the Chunin's hand was a thickly stuffed manila folder, which he presented to Mitokado. The elder opened it and flipped through the first few pages. Then he frowned and snapped the thing shut. "Well, that appears to be in order. Namikaze, it's your lucky day. It seems that you have been cleared of the murder charge." "What?" Danzo thundered, springing up from his own chair with such violence that it toppled to the ground with a loud clatter. Shikamaru edged closer to the door. With so many people suddenly standing, the room began to feel more crowded. "What is the meaning of this, Homura?" "It's all here," Danzo, his colleague murmured, handing him the file. The man Namikaze Naruto killed was actually a ninja. Yasu Takashi, rank, Chunin. Mitokado nudged his glasses further up the bridge of his nose and looked at Danzo directly. "I'm surprised you didn't recognize him. It says that he was assigned under your command 2 years ago." To his credit, the one-eyed veteran coolly brushed off Mitokado's subtle accusation. "There's a lot of ninja in my task force, I don't know them all by sight." Turning to the blonde, he said, "Well, this is rather convenient for you, Naruto-kun, wouldn't you say? I'll wager you have your father to thank for this, as usual." Naruto bristled at the words, but surprisingly, elected not to respond. In any event, Danzo continued smoothly, "I think that, in light of his past history and the other 3 charges that still stand, we should at least require some measure for Naruto's rehabilitation from the Hokage." "Very well," Utatane said, finality in her voice. "Anbu, you may escort Namikaze home, while we formulate his sentencing recommendation." Kakashi was waiting for him when Naruto was led out of the interrogation chamber. "For Kami's sake," was the first thing the Junin said. "Couldn't you have at least waited until after we returned from Suna to get into this much trouble?" "Believe it or not, Kakashi-sensei, trouble tends to find me about as frequently as I go looking for it," his blonde student responded, grinning wryly. He looked to his side, expecting to see the Anbu, but apparently they had not deemed seeing him safely home a task worth their time. It was only he and Kakashi in the hallway. "Anyway, I know how the system works. Those old bats can only recommend a sentence. They have no power to enforce it, and they certainly have no way of keeping me from going on this mission. For some bizarre reason, Naruto had been in a particularly good mood ever since he had been informed that they would be leaving for Suna. You are aware of who actually has jurisdiction over those two things you mentioned, right? Kakashi pointed out. And who got you out of that bind in the first place? Naruto's expression darkened. He brought me back here so I can do these fucking missions, the blonde snarled. I doubt that he'd lock me up while I'm still useful. Naruto, grow up. Hitaki-san is right. The two Konoha nin turned to face Shikamaru, who had apparently just been dismissed by the elders. Despite the Chunin's blunt words, Naruto's face broke out in a genuine smile. Shikamaru, man, I'm glad you showed up. You know who was really responsible, the lazy nin replied laconically. Then he smiled as well. But it's good to see you back, even if you are troublesome. Naruto wanted to continue in the vein of disparaging his father's priorities, but he found that somehow his heart wasn't into it. Instead he said, how is Asuma-sensei doing? Still smoking 3 packs a day? Damn, now that I mention that, I could really use a smoke, he added under his breath. Don't do it here. Smoking's bad for you, Shikamaru said matter-of-factly. Besides, that crap you exhale stings my eyes. Asuma-sensei is fine. He's waiting for you to go visit him, actually. Keeps saying that you were the most talented idiot he ever trained to use wind elemental chakra. Yeah, I was a little slow on the uptake, the blonde admitted with a chuckle. Hey, are you busy? Why don't I buy you a drink for saving my ass in there? Before Kakashi could point out that they were leaving early the next day for Suna, Naruto and Shikamaru were already making their way down the hall, chatting amiably. The next day, Team 7 cut a grueling pace westward towards the Land of Wind. Besides a brief stop at a small village in river country to fill up on water, the 4 Konoha nin traveled through the day and well into the night, only sleeping for a few hours before setting off again. By mid-afternoon on the second day they had entered into the desert. It was hard going, and the desolate landscape took a toll on their pace. Surrounded by a flat, white line of sand for as far as the eye could see, even Naruto felt exhaustion overtake him faster than usual. It was not long before Kakashi called for a rest so that they could sleep through the worst heat of the day. Later that night, Team 7 set up camp. They were perhaps half a day's distance from Suna. Although the daytime was scorching hot, at night the desert retained no heat and became frigidly cold, to the point where the Konoha nin had to light a small fire and huddle around it to keep warm. As they sat around the fire and stared stupidly into the flames, Sakura asked suddenly, exactly how undercover is this mission going to be, Kakashi-sensei? It took a minute for the Junin to clear his head of the afterimages of the fire and respond. This mission isn't meant to be too dangerous. We're ostensibly here on a diplomatic mission, to talk over the terms of the Chunin exams Suna's hosting next year. But Suna nin aren't exactly stupid, I'm sure they'll realize that we're here to scope out their new cage, if they haven't already. Hopefully they'll want to remain on good terms with our village and let us meet with him. Never want to leave out the worst-case scenario, Sasuke prompted, and if we're not lucky? If you want to start a war with another village, what better way than to hold a team of their ninja hostage? Kakashi said dryly. We'll have to arrange for some means of escape then, just in case, Sakura concluded, stating the obvious. They were silent for a few minutes. Despite the chill, Naruto found himself beginning to doze off. Then, seems like a pretty stupid mission for the Hokage to send his son on, Sasuke said bluntly. If Naruto's captured, Suna could demand a lot more than usual. Naruto opened one eye to regard his teammate. Well, he replied, that all depends on how keen he is on getting me back. Sasuke scowled in disgust. Look, moron, I don't know why you suddenly seem to have all these father issues, but do you really think the Hokage would throw you to the dogs? Not exactly good for his public image, for one thing. The blonde turned away from his team. He tilted his head back to peer at the impassive stars, clearly visible in the cloudless desert sky. Oh, he will. He has before, when the dogs happened to be Danzo-shaped. The great chakra beast lashed its single tail violently back and forth as it rose to its full height. Sand billowed in thick streams, obscuring all but the tanuki's massive form. Shukaku's twisted voice sounded in an insane laugh as it leveled the village with lazy sweeps of its paws, shaking the earth with every step. A Godzilla formed from sand had arrived to raze Suna to the ground, and so far the only person not fleeing before it was Naruto, although he was very seriously considering the option. Wind-blown sand lashed at the blonde as he ran towards the colossus. The few villagers not wholly consumed by fear shouted after him as he passed them by. Through the strength of his resolve, Naruto managed to ignore them and the screaming voice of his own sense of self-preservation. "It's okay," the blonde said out loud in an attempt to reassure himself. But his voice was lost a whirl of destructive noise. "I just have to wake him up, that's all. Piece of cake." The tanuki continued to laugh as it batted down a few more buildings for good measure. Like a toddler presented with blocks, it seemed to be rather focused on knocking down anything before it that was taller than some set threshold. Fortunately, this meant that it was too occupied to go after the villagers, but Naruto had a feeling that, once it ran out of things to smash, Shukaku would be perfectly happy to start ripping people into shreds. When he finally got within reach, the Konoha nin stopped and stood his ground. He closed his eyes and forcibly slowed his breathing. Concentrated, tried to drown out the chaotic sounds that surrounded him. He was horribly out of practice, and it took a while for the calming feeling of natural energy to wash over him. Shukaku paused in mid-strike as a great screech cut through the air. Seconds later it received a nasty surprise as its left arm was completely sheared off at the shoulder. The sand demon roared in anger, swiveling its great head back and forth in order to locate the one who had dared injured it. Finally, its gaze found the lone Konoha nin. The blonde's eyes were still rimmed red with sage chakra. A shadow clone stood next to him, helping to support a newly formed Rasenshuriken. With a wild yell, Naruto and the clone hurled the second Rasenshuriken towards Shukaku. The sand beast reacted instantly, but it was too bulky to move away fast enough, and the jutsu impacted directly with its torso. The resulting vortex of wind eroded a great hole in the demon's middle, but unfortunately Shukaku was simply too large to be blown apart. Though the Rasenshuriken usually had no trouble shredding people into tiny bits, the tanuki was probably taller than the Hokage's tower and also made of sand. Naruto was well aware of the futility of attacking Shukaku's body. They were surrounded by the desert. There was simply no way for him to completely wear away the demon's massive form faster than it restored itself. But at least Shukaku had noticed him. He could bank on the tanuki's bloodlust to lure it out of the village. If he lived that long, of all the stupid shit he'd gotten himself into through the years, this had to top the list. One day prior, no one was in a good mood by the time they reached Suna's impressively tiered gates. The combination of desert heat with relentless travel had all of Team 7 on edge. Even the normally unflappable Kakashi seemed impatient as he negotiated with the guards for their admittance. Fortunately, it only took a few minutes for the Suna nin to go over their documents and assign one of their own to lead them into the village's interior. Their guide, a brown-haired ninja who had been hanged into inconspicuousness but retained an annoyingly noticeable manner of ending his sentences, showed them to a modest apartment near the center of the village and then, thankfully, left to their own devices. Wisely, Kakashi gave his team the rest of the day to relax and promptly fell asleep. Sakura looked at their unconscious sensei in disgust, then said to her teammates, "You guys want to go explore the village a bit? We should probably stay put," Sasuke pointed out. "There might be enemies of Konoha who know we're here." "You," Naruto said, "are way too paranoid." And then he dropped his gear and left. He didn't have far to go, but apparently the Suna nin shadowing him was not very good at his job, as Naruto managed to lose him within a few blocks. The typically cramped and maze-like streets grew wider as the blonde neared his destination. Even the houses began to look nicer in general. Being the former Kage's son, Gaara had always lived in an upscale part of town. Every hidden village had its own unique architectural style, usually at least partially dictated by its natural surroundings. That being said, it was never obvious to Naruto why Suna preferred domes instead of flat roofs. Maybe it had something to do with staving off the heat. The building where Gaara lived was always cool. It was also basically just a giant hemisphere of sandstone, the same drab, dusty color as the desert. Naruto raised a fist to knock, but the door opened before he could complete the action, and he found himself staring at Temari. "I saw you on your way here," she said. "Come in." The house Gaara shared with his siblings had changed drastically since Naruto had last visited. Before, it had seemed that the building's occupants held no particular attachment to the place, but now it looked like they had actually bothered to try and furnish the place, making it seem a great deal more homey. Nice. Tamari led him into the kitchen and poured him a tall glass of iced tea. Gaara's not home, she said. He took a sip. It was cold and minty, delightfully refreshing. Is he out on a mission? You could say that. The kunoichi smiled. Are you here with the diplomatic team Konoha sent? Yeah, I'm sort of, on that team. Tamari glanced sharply at him. You said you had no intentions of returning to duty. No intentions. But, Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, I guess Konoha didn't like having its loose cannon unaccounted for. When's your brother coming back? Any minute now, probably. And with impeccable coincidence, the front door opened again and Gaara of the Sand stepped inside. He wore a white robe over his dark clothes, and in his hand was a wide-brimmed hat emblazoned with the symbol of wind. Black-rimmed eyes peered impassively at his blonde guest. Long time no see, Naruto. Gaara had perfect comedic timing, even if it was unintentional. The relaxed atmosphere rapidly dissipated as Naruto erupted. Gaara, you fucking son of a bitch. Why didn't you tell me that you're the goddamn case cage? The redhead smiled faintly. I wanted it to be a surprise. Good job, Naruto groused. I'm surprised. Now can we go and get wasted already? There was a knock on the door. Kakashi answered it, only to find himself staring into the face of an unfamiliar ninja. Tall, with pale skin and red hair. There were thick black markings around his eyes and a curious tattoo on the left side of his forehead. He wore no hite, but had strapped onto his back an enormous, battered-looking gourd. I brought Naruto back, the stranger said, stepping to the side. Kakashi tried to appear unfazed as his wayward blonde student appeared, supported by a pillow of floating sand. Hi Kakashi-sensei. Naruto slurred weakly before trailing off into incomprehensibility. He was obviously very drunk. The Junin said, blinking. He opened the door wide to let Naruto stumble inside and onto a couch. The strange ninja guided the sand in a thin, rope-like stream back into his gourd with a closed fist. I am Gaara, he said simply. Sorry for the trouble. Naruto always thinks that he can outdrink me. Gaara of the Sand, Kakashi recalled. Son of the former Case Cage. A particularly powerful ninja who was host to the one-tailed Shukaku, and as such, held power over the flow of sand. There had also been rumors amongst the Anbu that the Jinchuriki of Suna was a completely sadistic psycho. Fortunately, Gaara seemed to be in reasonable control of his faculties. He didn't even look tipsy, the Junin marveled. No trouble. Thanks for bringing him back. I was starting to get worried. You needn't be, the redhead replied. I will personally guarantee your team's safety during your stay here. He turned to leave. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Hitaki-san. Kakashi watched as the Suna nin left, his visible eye narrowed. Then he closed the door and directed his attention to Naruto, who was draped bonelessly over the couch, looking a little sick. If you're gonna puke, go do it in the bathroom, Kakashi told him heartlessly. Is he gone? The blonde asked, groaning. Yes, he's gone. Care to tell me how you came to know the Case Cage? Naruto giggled. Ha, Kakashi-sensei, you're pretty smart. Then he frowned and said, I'm going out for a smoke. Kakashi frowned. Coming out of Naruto's mouth, that could mean anything from, I am going to go outside and smoke a cigarette, to, I am going to find a brothel and fuck my brains out and show up tomorrow 3 hours late to a 1-hour meeting with a giant hangover. But he was beginning to understand that self-destructive behavior was the way the blonde had learned to avoid the larger issues in his life. Including, apparently, his inability to open up in any way to anyone. Naruto, you're not going anywhere, the Junin said, making his voice as flat as possible. And don't dodge my question. Naruto peered cynically up at him. Is that an order, Hitaki-san? The Junin sucked in a breath, then let it out in a sigh. No, he said finally. For a minute, he thought the blonde was going to hightail it out of the apartment. Then Naruto sagged back against the couch, his eyes clouded with unspoken thoughts. Of all the people I could be talking to, you must be taking advantage of my drunk state, he said quietly, not sounding drunk at all. A slow smile warmed his expression. Awkwardly, Kakashi began, you don't. I wish I could tell you that I wreaked havoc everywhere when I left Konoha, but that would be a lie. The Junin blinked at his student, who was suddenly grinning at him, although it looked more like a grimace. In my desire to get as far as humanly possible from Konoha, I got lost and somehow ended up in the middle of the fucking desert. In retrospect, it may have worked out better if I had attempted to navigate while sober. Anyway, I stumbled into Team Baki, that's Gaara and his two older siblings, Tamari and Kankuro. They had just returned from a mission and their Junin sensei had been killed. Obviously, I caught them at a bad time. Baki. That's right, this would be right about when Orochimaru did a number on Suna, Kakashi mused. Yeah, well, Gaara tried to kill me, pretty much immediately. He was, kinda crazy back then. Kakashi, recalling the lacerated body in the morgue, and then the easy, almost unconscious way Gaara had nudged Sand into life, wondered at the battle that must have been. Anyway, eventually Tamari recognized me and told Gaara to stop, because I was the Hokage's son. Naruto chuckled a little. Gaara went fucking apeshit. He went into this half Gaara, half Shukaku mode, almost killed me. Even his siblings couldn't stop him. But you did. Yeah, it wasn't easy, but I managed to incapacitate him. In their gratitude, Tamari and Kankuro tied me up and carried us both back to Suna. But since Suna and Konoha were ostensibly allies back then, they treated me pretty well. Took me to their house. I asked them not to tell anyone that I was there. Surprisingly, they didn't. Suna was mourning the Yondaime, so no one really noticed me anyway. Except Gaara. He would come visit me every day. The first time, I thought he was going to finish me off, but it turns out he just wanted to talk. Apparently, I was the first person who'd ever beaten him. And we had something in common. Kakashi had heard of the Yondaime Cage's treatment of his youngest son. Father issues, he guessed dryly. Yeah, it was the start of a beautiful friendship. Anyway, eventually I managed to talk Gaara out of the whole crazy thing. He's kind of a pacifist now, actually. There was certainly more to the story than that, but Kakashi didn't press him. Instead he said, "Mind telling me why you didn't say something sooner?" Hey, I didn't know he was the fucking Cage until this afternoon. Naruto protested. I haven't seen the guy in a while, alright? Kakashi snorted softly, but believed him. Well, that's it. Can I have my smoke now? Go to sleep. You need to quit, and that's an order. Seeing Naruto bristle, the Junin added, this time in a softer tone, we're going to have to talk about Danzo sometime. For both our sakes. Yeah, probably, Naruto muttered, sounding less than enthusiastic. Then he closed his eyes and fell asleep on the couch. In the end, no one had seen it coming, but several people really should have. The meeting had been brief. All the details of the upcoming Chunin exams had been hammered out with surprising ease. Gaara made an intelligent and straightforward cage, so it didn't surprise anyone when he bluntly informed them of Suna's stance towards Konoha. It did seem to displease a few of his advisors, however, when Gaara stated his intention to honor the alliance between the two countries. They looked on the conversation with narrowed eyes, but did not say anything. There were some in Suna who still blamed Konoha for the loss of their previous cage. Although Orochimaru had been operating under someone else's banner by then, he was still a Konoha missing nin. Furthermore, the past few years had surfaced a handful of ugly rumors concerning Konoha's direct involvement in the situation. Once, Kakashi might have put those rumors out of mind, but given his recent encounters with the length of Danzo's reach, he was no longer so sure that the theories were unfounded. Afterwards, they decided to meet up with Gaara's siblings and get lunch. Team 7 had been allowed to choose the place, but ultimately Kakashi had been forced to step in between their bickering and decide, settling on okonomiyaki. Unfortunately, they had barely stepped out into the street when it happened. A large, odd-looking white bird flitted down from somewhere. It moved in a strangely mechanical way, peering at them with hollow eyes. Then the creature exploded. Immediately a wave of sand blanketed them. It absorbed most of the impact, but they were all blown back in separate directions. Kakashi managed to find his students, who were fortuitously still together, in the midst of the confusion. Sasuke, eyes whirling, shouted and pointed to where Gaara lay on the ground. Apparently, in his rush in directing his sand to protect everyone else, the Jinchuriki had paid too little attention to covering himself. Standing beside his prone body was the hanged guard who'd escorted them to their apartment the previous day. "You!" Naruto snarled, preparing to charge rashly at him. Sasuke was barely able to pull him back as two more explosions, smaller this time but no less dangerous, went off before them, creating a large plume of dust that further obscured the cage from view. "Let me go," Naruto snarled. When Sasuke didn't, He expounded, Gaara's unconscious. At this rate, fucking Shukaku will. He didn't have a chance to continue. The sand that lay dormant on the ground began to tremble, then exploded into the air, streaming around them in a frenetic dance. They turned to see Gaara, standing, his eyes closed and arms outstretched in a parody of supplication. A voice that was not his poured from his mouth, terrible and utterly insane. Free, free at last, Naruto swore, loudly. That's Shukaku, he told his teammates, who were watching in shock as sand enveloped the cage's body, forming a monstrous-looking shell. Right, Kakashi said. Let's. Before he could finish his sentence, a white shape came flying towards them. Team 7 scattered before it exploded, creating a crater in the street where they had once been. Fuck, who the fuck is that guy? Naruto exclaimed. Sakura, Sasuke, you two go after him, Kakashi told them calmly. Be careful. He seems like a long-range fighter. Naruto and I will take down Shukaku. By the time he'd said this, the demon Tanuki had grown several feet taller and had whipped up a full-blown sandstorm. People ran screaming from the scene in a panic, but at least they had the sense to flee. You've dealt with this before, right? Kakashi asked Naruto as Team 7 split up. Not like this. When Gaara's knocked out, Shukaku comes out. That's why he never sleeps. So we need to wake him up. Naruto groaned. It's not that easy, Kakashi-sensei. You've seen Gaara's sand. It's an absolute defense. It's hard enough when he's awake, but the demon has a lot more power. And we're in the middle of the fucking desert. As if to emphasize his words, Shukaku rose to its fully formed height and casually batted down someone's house. It tilted its head back to give a howl of violent elation, then began to make its way towards the center of Suna. We have to get it out of the village, Kakashi said grimly. Before there is no village. Meanwhile, Explosion Nin was keeping Sakura and Sasuke at bay with well-placed explosives. Then, unexpectedly, Sakura punched into the ground, knocking up several large chunks of rubble skyward and forcing the enemy ninja to scramble away from the shower of rocks that resulted. He managed to avoid being hit, but in that moment of distraction Sasuke had closed the distance between them. The sound of chirping birds filled the air. When the chaos cleared, Sasuke's Reikiri had gone clean through Explosion Nin's right shoulder. He had dropped his henge, revealing himself to be a young man with pale blonde hair, most of it pulled back in a ponytail, leaving the rest to curtain over his left eye. He wore an Iwagakure Hite Ite with a deep scratch going horizontally through the hidden village symbol and a curious robe, black and emblazoned with red clouds. The only curious thing Sasuke wore was an expression of shock on his face, which quickly bled into one of pure hatred. That robe, he snarled. Where is Itachi? Despite the situation he was in, Explosion Nin smirked. Itachi? No, I'm Deidara. I thought you looked like him. Yeah. His anger completely blanketing good sense, Sasuke wrapped his free hand around the other ninja's neck. Where is he? Deidara's smirk widened. I'll tell you, if you beat me, yeah. For now, have a taste of my art. Sasuke. It was Sakura, screaming as she ran toward him. On your arm. Sasuke looked down just in time to see a small white spider scuttling along his elbow. As Deidara raised his hand to form the seal that would make it detonate, the Uchiha jerked his arm, throwing the spider up in the air. Sakura shrieked as the resulting explosion blew both of them back, but Sasuke had it worse. The Kunoichi rushed to his side as he staggered to his feet. I'm fine, he told her, but his left side was bruised and bloody. Go after him. Sasuke, she began to say, then stopped, her attention suddenly diverted. A large, round white bird was rising into the air, Deidara standing on its back. Fuck, he's going to get away. Sasuke raged. Totally lost to anger, he clapped one hand over his left eye. No, Sasuke. You can't use that jutsu here, Sakura began, but before anything could happen, the space around Deidara began to warp and distort. Startled, the missing nin twisted around as the warping centered around his left arm and focused until, with an indescribable noise, the arm vanished with a spray of blood. Damn it, Kakashi swore to himself, his own hand covering his original eye, the other displaying a fully formed Mangekyo Sharingan. Already he was feeling the incredible strain. Sorry, Naruto, he panted. Sasuke is on the verge of doing something incredibly stupid. The blonde nodded sharply. I'll lead Shukaku out of the village. We'll catch up to you as soon as we can, his Junin-sensei said. Then he added, a bit awkwardly, I believe in you, Naruto. The present. It was nice, Naruto thought, to have someone believe in you. It would have been nicer if that belief had been placed in a situation like winning a shogi match, or beating someone in a spar. Instead, for some demented reason Kakashi had to believe in his ability to save an entire village from certain destruction by a rampaging 4-story tall monster. At least he still had Shukaku on his tail. They were more or less at the outskirts of the village now, where the Great Wall divided Suna from endless desert. With a few chakra-enhanced leaps, Naruto summited the wall and faced the enormous beast. Pathetic maggot, the creature spat. I will crush you. No doubt, Naruto agreed. But you'll have to catch me first, shithead. And with that, he dove off the wall and into the desert. Shukaku followed, plowing through the enormous structure as if it were made of cardboard. The amount of sand in the air was amazing. It was only Naruto's own skillful manipulation of the wind around him that kept his skin from being eroded away. For a brief moment the two opponents stood motionless, one dwarfing the other, while the desert wailed around them. Then the blonde bit his thumb and slammed his hand into the ground, hoping desperately that he had enough chakra left for what he was about to do. When the coils of smoke cleared, the great scarred toad Gamabunta stared coldly down at his summoner. Brat, he said in his deep, rumbling voice, I haven't forgiven you yet. That's fine, Naruto replied, as if they were having a conversation over coffee. Do you think you can forgive me enough though, to stop this sand demon from killing me? The great toad locked eyes with Shukaku. A frog, the tanuki screamed in its twisted voice. I'll rend your flesh and dance on your bones. Gamabunta gave a long-suffering sigh. Kid, I don't know how you manage to get yourself in these kinds of situations. But for the sake of your old man, climb on. What about for my own sake? Naruto muttered as he alighted on top Gamabunta's head. We've got to get close enough so I can jump over and smack Gaara until he wakes up. With a degree of swiftness surprising for his size, Gamabunta surged forward, brandishing his great knife. Shukaku leapt back to avoid the blow, but the knife caught him inside and he screeched with pain. Immediately sand snaked from the ground to fill in the wound. Recovering, the sand demon sucked in a vast amount of air and pounded hard on his hugely distended belly. The resulting bullets of wind rent air and sand alike. Gamabunta managed to avoid the first barrage, but the second caught him by surprise, connecting with his shoulder and knocking him back several hundred meters. The toad regained his feet with a groan. Can't take too many more of those, kid. You got a light? The toad boss jumped forward once more, this time spewing a large stream of oil from his mouth, which Naruto promptly set on fire with a quick Kaiden jutsu. The impromptu flamethrower enveloped the lower part of Shukaku's body with a heat so fierce that it temporarily immobilized the tanuki's legs. Gamabunta charged at the demon once more, intending to take Naruto close enough to jump over, but Shukaku flailed madly, one of its paws clipping the air inches above the blonde's head. The accompanying wind nearly knocked Naruto off the toad boss, but he hung on gamely. No good, Gamabunta panted. Again, he inhaled and spat, but this time Naruto waited until Shukaku's arm had been drenched in oil before loosing his fire jutsu. The tanuki's limb lit up violently, and as it patted the flames out, Gamabunta was able to bear Naruto close enough to where Gaara's body lay, embedded in Shukaku's great head. Good luck, brat, Naruto heard the toad boss say as he dashed forward and leapt for all he was worth. I'm at my limit, so I'll see you later. He did not land prettily, but the blonde was able to hold on and regain his feet. He scrambled for Gaara, but before he could get to him, a massive paw of sand enveloped him, plucking him off as if he were a fly. The ground and sky whirled into one around him as he was lifted away. Shukaku's massive face leered at him psychotically as it screeched, "Suffer. I will make your death slow." And the demon began to squeeze. The pressure was overwhelming. It didn't take long before Naruto felt his ribs crack and his vision begin to blur. As he felt himself slip into unconsciousness, something seemed crawl up from deep within him, something that burned and roiled with ancient anger. It was a part of himself that he had felt before, always familiar, sometimes closer to the surface than others. It had always been there to feed his deep-seated rage against Konoha and against his father, but now it was stirring into a different action. Shukaku screamed in agony as the paw holding the Konoha nin suddenly became enveloped in a dense mass of red chakra. The sand itself began to dissolve from the sheer heat, reforming as glass. An overwhelming presence blanketed the tanuki's small mind with a feeling of sheer terror. "You," the tanuki howled. "I know you." But it was Naruto's voice that answered him, although it was tinged with something deep and terrible. "What the fuck are you talking about? Fucking burn, shithead." And the blonde wrenched free of its grasp, landing lightly on the lump of glass that used to be Shukaku's paw. Flaming chakra surrounded him and enveloped the whole of the demon's arm. Sand melted red hot and dripped viscously onto the ground. "You're fucking dead," Naruto screamed, and in that moment he sounded rather psychotic himself. Waves of heat exploded from as the tide of red climbed higher and higher, licking the edge of Shukaku's head and growing dangerously close to Gaara's prone body. The air around the tanuki's body shimmered, mirage-like. Then someone was screaming at him, "Naruto! Stop!" It was Sasuke, bleeding and limping toward him. Sakura followed, supporting their Junin-sensei. All three were battered-looking and covered with dust. The Uchiha's voice brought Naruto back to sanity, and suddenly he realized what he was doing, causing his rage to dissipate instantly. Slowly, the red chakra faded out like a dying flame. Naruto scrambled along the curve of Shukaku's head, knelt by Gaara's exposed face, and gave it a good smack. The redhead's eyes snapped awake, and what remained of Shukaku's body also began to dissipate, leaving behind a platform of sand that bore Naruto and Gaara gently back down to earth. The cage winced, rubbing his head. Fuck, he looked around. The wind was already gently redistributing the giant pile of sand Shukaku had left behind, but in addition there were large lumps of wickedly edged glass everywhere. What happened? Adrenaline was quickly leaving Naruto's body and being replaced by a feeling of heavy exhaustion. Still, he managed to grin at his friend. "I'll tell you all about it later, but it's good to have you back," he said to Gaara. Then he closed his eyes. Gaara managed to catch him in a cushion of sand before he hit the ground. At the border between fire and river country, where forests gave way to water-cut mountains, an Anbu stood with a bird in his hands. It was a rust-colored desert hawk, a species indigenous to Suna and commonly used in its native country as a messenger bird. Indeed, someone had placed a collar around its neck and attached to it a small pocket the size of a pillbox. However, this bird had been struck down from the sky before it managed to reach its intended destination. One of its wings was bent at an unnatural angle, obviously broken. The other flapped wildly like a flag caught in the wind as it struggled ferociously against its captor. Even though its wicked talons and beak scored several deep gashes across his skin, the Anbu didn't even flinch as he calmly adjusted his grip and broke the hawk's neck with one smooth twist of his hands. He removed the message from its container and tucked it carefully into one of the many pouches gathered at his waist. Then, blurring through a series of seals, he set the bird's corpse aflame with a Kaiden jutsu. By the time the fire died out sufficiently to uncover a pile of charred bones and feathers, the Anbu was already well on his way back to Konoha. On account of the large amount of sensitive material kept there, Danzo had gone through great pains to conceal his private study. Few were even aware of its existence, and only two other Konoha nin, the top-ranking members of Root who served as his personal bodyguards, knew its exact location, a storage unit in the residential sector leased under the name of a civilian. Even they were not with him tonight as Danzo pulled the intercepted missive from Suna out from one wide sleeve and spread it out on his work desk. The flame of his lamp flickered wildly in the drafty room, casting constantly shifting light over strangely formed characters. It was an encrypted message, but of a very special variety. Danzo doubted that even the code unit had access to its key. Only the leaders of the hidden villages, the 5 cages, were allowed to use this particular cipher. Thus, in Konoha, only the Hokage held the scroll needed to unscramble the message. And Danzo, who had previously taken the opportunity to make a copy for himself. Translation only took a few minutes. The completed message was not very long, and written in a cool, clipped tone. The elder wondered about the one who had composed it, but he was offered no insight into the mind of the cage. On the subject of Namikaze Naruto, the contents were much more revealing. Danzo read the message twice, just to be sure. Then he threw the scroll over his lamp. It quickly caught on fire, scattering small fragments of burning paper into the air that glowed like summer fireflies. The elder sat back in his chair with a loud sigh. For 16 years he had waited for some indication of the Kyuubi's location. Despite the Sandame's dying speculation, the demon fox had never shown itself. Until now, Danzo had always been adept at playing father and son against each other in the interest of maintaining his own influence over the village. The truth of Kyuubi's existence could undermine all of his efforts. It was bad enough that Naruto was back in Konoha. Danzo was sure of one thing. If the boy could not be controlled, then he would have to be killed. The elder snuffed out his lamp before sweeping out of the room and into the night. Naruto woke up to the uncomfortable sensation of being smothered in white and immediately realized two things. First, that he was in a hospital, and second, that he wanted to check out of said hospital as quickly as humanly possible. However, his body apparently didn't want to cooperate. Even the act of sitting up in the bed caused stabbing pains to pierce his chest. The blonde lifted up the edge of his hospital gown to reveal taped ribs and badly bruised skin. Considering that he usually recovered pretty quickly, Shukaku must have given him one hell of a thrashing. Though his body felt exhausted, Naruto's mind was restless. He had been placed in a private room, and though it was one of the expensive, nice kinds, there wasn't anyone in sight. Not even a medic nin to tell him how long he'd been out. There was a call button on the wall next to his bed, and for a minute he considered pressing it, but then he realized that it would probably just result in a prolonged, uncomfortable checkup and decided to leave it alone. Another, worse, idea struck him. Taking a deep breath, he sat back against the annoyingly soft pillows and touched the tips of the fingers of each hand together, then closed his eyes and tried to relax to absolute stillness. This time, he felt the nature chakra draw in more quickly, bathing him in warmth and dulling the pain of his injuries. He sensed about a dozen chakra signatures, all but two of them static. The mobile ones, most likely corresponding to patrolling medic nin, were fairly faint and therefore probably far away. This was his chance. Carefully, Naruto extracted himself from the bed. He was able to stand without much difficulty. Even without the aid of natural chakra, his legs would probably be strong enough to hold him up, which was a good sign. He gently tugged the IV free from his forearm and removed the other electrodes taped over his torso as best as he could, then dug around in the closet until he found his clothes. He had just finished pulling on his pants on when he felt an enormous chakra presence enter the building and continue toward his room. Realizing that it could only belong to one person, Naruto swore and headed for the window, not even bothering with his shirt. He managed to get two of the latches undone before sand streamed in between him and the window, blocking his access. "Naruto, get your ass back in bed." Gaara's voice was not amused. The blonde scowled at his friend, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest. "You're no fun," Naruto said, but complied. His sage chakra was rapidly dissipating anyhow, which meant that the pain was beginning to return. "If you try something like that again," Gaara said calmly, "I will tell the medic nin, and they will chain you to the bed." "Kinky," Naruto said. "I've always liked the idea of nurses having their way with me." His expression, however, suggested otherwise. The case cage moved to the side of the bed, noting with narrowed green eyes the electrodes and discarded IV line that lay on the ground. "I am going to call a nurse in here," he said. "Traitor," Naruto exclaimed, but Gaara was already pushing the call button. It took less than a minute for a medic nin to arrive. An older man, maybe 45, grizzled looking and missing a notable chunk out of his nose. He took in the situation immediately, saluted, and said, "Shall I send for the straps, Case Cage Sama?" Seeing the man's expression, Naruto turned positively green. Luckily, Gaara was feeling merciful, as he quickly fabricated an excuse as to why all of the monitoring devices that had once been attached to the blonde's body had somehow ended up on the floor. The medic nin frowned, obviously not really buying it, but he did not question the case cage's story. Instead, he prepared a fresh IV and, accidentally, missed Naruto's vein a few times when trying to reinsert it. "If you're awake," the medic nin said briskly after he had rendered his patient hospital complaint once more, "I should give you a quick checkup." I'm really tired right now," Naruto said. "Maybe later?" he added lamely. "Very well," the nurse said, excusing himself. "You know," Naruto said after he'd left, "it's really not fucking fair. I fight and beat you, again. But I'm the one who ends up looking like shit. At least you're alive, Gaara replied. What were you thinking, going up against Shukaku by yourself? It's not like I had a choice, Naruto countered. Kakashi had his hands full after my idiot teammate tried to set the village on fire. Permanently. The Cage sighed, running a hand through his dark red hair. It was an unusually human gesture, and from it Naruto suddenly realized how worn out his friend looked, how his eyes were even more shadowed than usual. Gaara must have somehow sensed his sudden worry, because a small smile appeared on his face. I'm fine, he said. The villagers actually took the whole thing quite well. Naruto was incredulous. You mean, you went apeshit crazy on Suna, knocked down about 20 buildings, and everyone's cool with it? Not everyone, the redhead admitted. A few people wanted to arrest your team. They think we knocked you unconscious? Konoha and Suna have never been on the best of terms. I'm trying, but the Orochimaru incident is still in everyone's minds. It figures that creepy bastard would be causing us problems from beyond the grave, Naruto muttered. They fell into silence after that. Gaara seated himself in one of the plastic visitors' chairs by Naruto's bed and stared out the window, his eyes distant. He seemed calm enough, but it did not escape Naruto's attention that something seemed to be troubling him. The blonde chose not to pry and instead lay back against his pillow, feeling exhaustion beginning to weigh down his eyelids. Abruptly, Gaara's voice brought him back to attention. Naruto, what did you do to stop Shukaku at the end of the fight? For a minute, Naruto said nothing. He had been expecting this question, but was unsure how to answer it, was even dreading thinking about it because it reminded him how completely, frighteningly out of control he had been. Gaara sensed his hesitation and amended quickly, you don't have to. No, Naruto interrupted, it's better if I do. He frowned, drew into himself until his memory was bathed in the desert wind. He remembered the overwhelming feeling of sand closing in on him like a vice, squeezing and squeezing until the pressure seemed unbearable. The pounding of blood in his heart, in his skull. The red heat rising inside his chest like a building tide. Shukaku was killing me, the blonde said slowly. I thought it was going to crush me into pieces. At first I was starting to pass out, but then I began to feel really strange. Kind of angry that it had beaten me. He blinked. That's pretty weird, isn't it? You'd think that I'd be scared that I was gonna die. Not angry because some giant sand monster had gotten the better of me. Anyway, that was when this red chakra appeared everywhere and started melting Shukaku into goo. I've never seen anything like it before, but I think it was coming from me, because the angrier I got, the more of it there was. But that doesn't make sense either, 'cause summoning Gamabunta ate up the last of my reserves. His friend said nothing for a moment, but turned back to the window, face shadowed. Naruto knew the Suna nin well enough to recognize that he was thinking deeply about something. Gaara, in his own right, was as much of a genius as Sasuke or Shikamaru, only his intellect was of the steady, tenacious kind. Faced with a problem, Gaara would not let go until he had devised an elegant, effective solution. So Naruto flopped back against his pillow and waited for him to sort it out. Finally, Gaara spoke, but it was far from what Naruto expected to hear. You know, sometimes I can feel Shukaku's emotions if they're strong enough. And he doesn't like you. Shukaku's a demon, Gaara, Naruto said, as if pointing out the obvious. I didn't know it liked anyone. Yes, but he really doesn't like you. In fact, I think he's afraid of you. What? Out of all the adjectives Naruto could use to describe the demon, fearful was not one of them. Exactly, Gaara agreed. There isn't much that Shukaku would be afraid of, and humans are at the bottom of his list. The only thing I can come up with is maybe another tailed beast. Exactly where are you going with this? Naruto asked, confused. A higher-ranking Biju. Well, I suppose that could be any of them. But a Biju with red chakra, and the Yondaime was the one who coincidentally sealed the Kyuubi. Realizing where his friend was going with this, the blonde broke out laughing, then winced as pain jolted through his abused chest. Gaara, I think that I would know if I were a Jinchuriki. Gaara's only response was to give Naruto a flat look. Dude, you don't mean, the Konoha nin's laugh faltered. You can't be serious. Have you actually seen the statue your father supposedly sealed the Kyuubi into? No, why the hell would I want to go look at it? Besides, it's not exactly a museum exhibit. The Anbu have it under 24-hour surveillance. I don't know then, Gaara said. He looked tired. But that's the conclusion I come to after considering everything that happened. I think we should talk to Hitaki-san when he wakes up. Naruto said, sure. Wait, he's not awake yet? How long have I been out? 2 days. The medic nin say that Hitaki-san is expected to regain consciousness today as well. Gaara glanced at the small clock mounted on the wall, frowning at how quickly the numbers had changed. I should go. I'll let your teammates know that you've regained consciousness. Gee, thanks, the blonde muttered as his friend left the room. Too tired to give Gaara's words any serious consideration, but too restless to go back to sleep, he leaned further into the lumpy bed and tried to amuse himself by counting the cracks in the ceiling. Mouse and Eagle always patrolled together. It was one of the perks of being on Danzo's payroll. And while the pair rarely conversed, route training tended to select against garrulousness. Having a constant companion while on duty was nevertheless reassuring. Thus, neither of them thought anything of it when they were both switched that night from watching the village gate to guarding the Hokage. The Yondaime often worked late, but for some reason the regular patrol schedule ended at 8, so it wasn't unusual for on-duty Anbu to be reassigned on short notice. The Hokage was still hard at work when they arrived at the tower to relieve the previous watch. He was seated behind a desk stacked high with paperwork, scribbling his way through a thick packet with a small frown on his face. Relations between Konoha and the other hidden villages had been dissolving recently at a fast clip. Diplomatically, it was the Hokage who had to pick up the slack, and that meant letters to be written, envoys to be debriefed, and, of course, spies to be selected and dispatched. Not that Mouse or Eagle knew anything about the matter. Their knowledge of the current state of affairs was that it caused the Yondaime to work late. Whatever effect it might have had on the man was of little concern to them. Their allegiance was to Danzo first. Keeping watch over the Hokage was just a pretext to maintain the illusion of their loyalty. Thus, neither of them was really paying particular attention when, at around 9 o'clock, 2 masked nin smashed through the panoramic windows and immediately set upon Konoha's leader with the intent to kill. It was painfully clear to the Anbu, even as they leapt toward the Hokage's desk, that they were far too late. Trained assassins killed in an instant. Their task was only made easier when the target was taken unawares. Loose sheets of paper flew everywhere, obscuring the Hokage and his assailants from view. The room was completely, overwhelmingly silent. It was over in the space of a second, and when everything had settled, the Yondaime was standing over 2 unmoving bodies. There was blood streaked over his white robes. It was impossible to tell whose it was. He held in his hand one of his signature 3-pronged kunai. Another was buried in the ground a few feet away. Anbu, the Hokage bellowed. His expression was terrifying. Where the hell are my Anbu? Mouse and Eagle watched as the office suddenly began to fill with masked Konoha nin. If the events hadn't happened so quickly, they might have anticipated what was coming next and made a successful escape. Unfortunately, in their dazed state, they were barely able to register that the majority of the Anbu present seemed to hail from Root. I thought, the Yondaime was saying, in a quiet but dangerous tone, that becoming Hokage meant that I no longer had to kill people myself. That I had my Anbu to protect me. He placed the kunai in his hand on the desk. There was an audible click as metal met wood in the silent, motionless room. When the protection of my son had been bungled, I thought it had been an honest mistake. Now I'm not so sure. Something stinks in this organization, and I intend to find out what. The blonde's eyes were glacial and intense. Nara, some of the ninja present flinched at the breach of protocol, but no one said anything as a deer-masked Anbu approached their leader and saluted lazily. Yes, Hokage-sama, I want everyone present here to be shaken down. Find out where their loyalties actually lie. Sir, Shikamaru acknowledged. Should I have everyone taken down to Ibiki-san's division? No, the Hokage said. Bring Ibiki and his force here. I'll see to it that no one leaves. Shikamaru saluted again and vanished. Mouse peered around the Hokage's desk. The bodies of the 2 assassins were gone as well. That was about when most of the Root nin realized that they had been set up. Contrary to what Gaara had predicted, Kakashi woke up 2 days later. By then, Naruto had recovered enough to be officially discharged, although the hospital made a point of sending a medic nin to check up on him daily. This irritated Sakura, who took it as a direct insult to her own abilities and compensated by zealously monitoring Naruto's condition. Between her ministrations and his injuries, Naruto found to his dismay that his activity was still heavily confined. So, despite the fact that they were returning to the hospital, Naruto enthusiastically accompanied his teammates to go visit their convalescent Junin sensei. They found Kakashi sitting up in bed, engrossed in one of his perverted little books. The blonde wondered how the man had smuggled it in. He'd probably gotten a nurse to do it. The Junin could be pretty charming if he put his mind to it. "Yo," the man said as they came in, raising one hand in greeting. "Kakashi-sensei, stop trying to act cool and put that trash away," Sakura snapped. Naruto had to hand it to her. The girl could talk in a way that made crossing her seem like a very, very bad idea. Sheepishly, their sensei put the book down. He looked haggard, probably hadn't recovered fully from the chakra exhaustion yet, and his movements were slow. "How are you feeling?" Sasuke asked. Naruto thought that it was unusually considerate of him. Then again, it was arguable Sasuke who had put Kakashi in this situation in the first place. "Pretty good," the Junin said, though no one believed him. "I think I'll be ready to check out of here soon." Sakura, who had grabbed Kakashi's chart from where it hung at the foot of his bed, looked up from flipping through it to say, "You're not going anywhere. We have to report back to the Hokage, especially after what happened with Shukaku," he protested weakly. "The case cage has already sent a message by Hawk. There's no need to hurry," Sasuke said. "This is important. Hawks can be intercepted." Clearly their sensei was grasping at straws. "Then Naruto can send another by Toad summon," Sakura countered. She was clearly not going to be convinced on the matter. The three talked with their sensei for a while longer before a nurse came in to usher them out, citing that the Junin was still recovering and needed his rest. They left, promising to visit again soon, and Kakashi asked that they bring another of his smutty books upon returning. Once outside, Naruto turned to his teammates and said, "You guys go on ahead. I'm going to stop by Gaara's for a bit." Sakura, still very much in medic nin mode, protested. "You're still recovering too, Naruto. It's better if you come back with us. Why worry about me now?" Naruto said. "You never did before." That wasn't true, and he knew it, but he also knew that the only way to get Sakura off his case was to piss her off. And it did the trick. Her eyes narrowed into cold green slits before she stormed off with Sasuke without so much as another word. The blonde watched them go. When their figures had vanished into the distance, he turned and went back into the hospital. It wasn't hard for him to avoid the nurses and get back into Kakashi's room. Apparently sneaking into a hospital was a lot easier than sneaking out of one. His Junin sensei looked up as he entered. His expression was quizzical. "What are you doing back here, Naruto?" "There's something I need to talk to you about," the blonde said. "Well, sure, what is it?" "It's about the Kyuubi attack." Kakashi's visible eye widened in surprise. "I don't think I can talk to you about that. You know that it's forbidden. It's not like the rule isn't broken all the time already," Naruto pointed out. His voice a little too casual, and it set off alarm bells in the Junin's mind. "Besides, I've already heard the story. I just want to know what you in particular remember about that day." "Naruto, I'll make it worth your while," his student continued. "You look pretty miserable here. If you tell me, I'll get you out of here." Suddenly Kakashi's face became so hopeful that another would have mistook the expression for one of intense pain. It was clear that he didn't like hospitals, either. "All right," he said shrewdly. "As long as you break me out first. Then I'll tell you everything I know about that day." Himiko was one of just 3 civilian nurses assigned to the wing devoted to caring for recuperating ninja. She was also the only one there from personal choice. Not many of the hospital staff were keen on looking after patients who, in addition to being uncooperative at best and willfully disobedient at worst, were also as a rule insane and well-versed in ways of causing lasting harm to others. Fortunately, Himiko had been born with a saintly amount of patience and understanding. Therefore, she had been the only one willing to tend to the infamous copy nin. A man obviously not used to being confined in a hospital and therefore very eager to be unbed-ridden. He had only just woken up, and she had already caught him trying to escape twice. The first time, she had discovered a log in place of a body in his bed and, 5 minutes later, an exhausted ninja collapsed halfway down the stairs. On the second occasion she had walked in at the inopportune moment of him trying to get out via the window. After she got him back into bed, Himiko had issued a warning that, upon any subsequent attempts, he would be immobilized by liberal application of rope and have his food delivered through a tube shoved up his nose. In reality, the patient's condition had been rapidly improving throughout the day, and it wouldn't have surprised Himiko if he were okay to be released by the next morning. This is why it came as such a shock to her when he died. She was just passing by his room when she heard the heart monitor alarm go off. Upon dashing inside, she found that the patient had flat-lined and was lying motionless in his bed. Some part of her thought, detachedly, that it was very strange. He had seemed well enough when the other Konoha nin stopped by for a visit 20 minutes ago. The rest of her, however, had no time to think. Takashi, Naoko, I need help in here. Someone get Dr. Soji. She quickly checked the patient's pulse, then scrambled for the defibrillator when she found none. Another nurse and a grizzled medic nin ran into the room just as she was spreading conductive gel over the copy nin's chest. Swiftly, Takashi grabbed the paddles and applied them to the patient, one below his right collarbone and the other just at the end of his ribcage on his left side. Clear. The current sent a spasm through the patient's body, but the monitor showed no change. Clear. Again, nothing. Himiko felt her anxiety begin to build. Damn it, Takashi was saying, his hands moving automatically through the procedure. We can't lose him. He's from the Konoha team. Case Cage Sama will. They never found out what the case cage was going to do, because Dr. Soji arrived at that moment and swiftly took charge of the situation. However, even with his direction, each attempt at defibrillation yielded nothing. Takashi tried several more times, but as the minutes wore on, it soon became clear that their patient was not going to revive. The ceaseless alarm of the heart monitor began to feel like a physical force crushing into Himiko's skull. Finally, Takashi stood back and expelled a loud sigh. The paddles hung loosely in his hands. I don't think he's coming back. Somberly, Dr. Soji noted the time of death. Himiko watched as workers arrived to cover the body and take it down to the morgue. She felt distraught. Perhaps if she had just practiced greater vigilance, had forbidden the visitation, but she had no time to dwell on it. There were many others to attend to, and a nurse's work was never done. Kakashi breathed a sigh of relief as he removed the sheet from over his head. He sat up, accepted the change of clothes Naruto handed him. The blonde turned around as he quickly dressed. You come up with the sickest ideas, the Junin said when he was finished. And why is it that I always end up around corpses when I'm with you? Quiet, Naruto hissed. If anyone walks in here, they'll have a shit fit and we'll be fucked. Kakashi wanted to point out that he hadn't been speaking loudly at all, and that there was no one around besides, but something about hospitals seemed to rile up his student more than usual. Since the Junin could relate to this last sentiment, he kept his thoughts to himself. When the coast was clear, the pair exited the morgue and made a beeline for the civilian wing. Security, not surprisingly, was a whole lot more lax there. Naruto had also been prudent enough to bring Kakashi a hat whose brim he pulled down firmly in order to obscure the scars on his face. The nurse at the front desk didn't even spare them a second glance as they walked past her and left the building. As the hospital grew further in the distance, Kakashi began to feel the shakiness return as adrenaline faded away. The electrodes that picked up the rhythm of his heart muscles and the action potentials they generated were sensitive to minute electrical changes. Thus, it had only taken a tiny of lightning chakra to fool the electrodes to assume his lack of a heartbeat. The genjutsu he'd placed upon the nurse to mask his pulse had taken an equally small amount of chakra, but pathetically enough, both tricks had knocked his reserves back down to practically nothing. Naruto, noticing the Junin's growing exhaustion, managed to get an arm out to support the man before his legs gave out. Oof. The blonde said as his sensei's full weight bore down on him. I'm not sure if this was the best idea anymore. If Sakura finds out about our little stunt, she'll skin us alive. Probably, Kakashi agreed bleakly, trying his best not to imagine how the kunoichi would react if she discovered that he'd snuck out of the hospital. Images of extreme violence coupled with rigorously enforced bed rest sprang into mind. His stomach took the opportunity to rumble loudly. Maybe food will do some good, Naruto mused. If you feel up to it. Kakashi had safely deposited the slop they'd given him for lunch underneath his bed earlier that day. Bit of a nasty surprise for whatever poor guy they had cleaning the place. Sounds great. Lead the way. Sakura's had me on rice porridge and natto for the past few days. I think it could do you some good. The meager bits of Kakashi's face that were actually visible turned slightly green. Naruto, I'd rather Relax, the blonde laughed. There's a ramen ya just down the street from here. Nothing like noodles and cold beer to get you back on your feet. It would figure that Naruto had taken care to scope out the ramen joints in Suna, but Kakashi didn't argue. The thought of the fatty, salty broth was starting to make his mouth water. Together, like a dilapidated chimera, the two hobbled away. Somewhere between his third and fourth beer, Kakashi came to two realizations. First, that he really had to pee, and second, that his blonde student was being suspiciously proactive about keeping his glass full. Unfortunately, by this point he was buzzed enough to not really care. Besides, the noodles were good, the beer was refreshing, and life outside of the hospital was a glorious and beautiful experience. He got up, awkwardly, and hobbled to the bathroom, somewhat relieved that he could make it there on his own. It would have been horrifying to have to ask for Naruto's assistance. Oja-san, another bowl please, the blonde was saying when he came back to the bar. Naruto had more or less consumed twice the number of bowls as him and was still going strong. The kid was a black hole when it came to his favorite meal, which was saying something, as most of the time it seemed like he didn't have much of an appetite at all, for food, at least. Hi, the ramen chef replied, picking up a fresh bowl. Tonkatsu, right? While he was waiting, Naruto turned to face the Junin, wearing a grin that made him feel very, very uncomfortable. Kakashi-sensei, I've held up my end, it's your turn now. Kakashi frowned, trying to figure out why Naruto could possibly want this information, and failing. Some small thought prickled the back of his brain, something about the brief glimpse he'd had of the blonde's fight with Shukaku, but it was difficult to concentrate, and in a moment he'd forgotten about it anyway. Alright, he said finally, but I don't know why you want to hear it from me. Plus, I wasn't even there when your father defeated the Kyuubi, no one was. Just humor me, Naruto said, his tone all too blithe. Well, the Junin said, and took another sip of his beer. When the Kyuubi appeared, the air around Konoha became thick with its heat. Life withered beneath the beast, and wherever it went, it left behind long swatches of blackened earth. Soon it became apparent that the Kyuubi was making a beeline for the village, and the Konoha nin responded accordingly, setting up barricades and organizing evacuation routes for civilians. Though the shinobi prepared to fight, it was painfully clear that they had no hope of defeating the massive creature, which was more of a force of nature than an enemy combatant. Still, there was some hope. The Biju could not be killed, but they could be sealed. So the Hokage, Jiraiya, and Sarutobi locked themselves in the library for the few precious hours they were given to prepare for the Kyuubi's arrival. That left the task of securing the defenses to Kakashi and his fellow Anbu captains. The work was bitter and morale was low. And all the while, Kakashi wondered just what his sensei was planning to do. He knew that the Kyuubi was too powerful to be held by any ordinary seal. He also knew that, as with jutsu, the price of a seal rose with its power, and in the case of Biju, said price usually involved human life. About 2 hours later, word came that the Yondaime, his predecessor, and his sensei had devised a plan. It was heartening news to most, but Kakashi wondered who would actually be the one to do the deed. Although the thought sickened him, he hoped that Minato would not take the burden upon himself. Kushina was due any day now, and the timing could not have been worse. Half an hour later, the Hokage called together the clan heads and the Anbu captains outside of the tower. He looked completely exhausted, as if he had already fought a battle and had only won by the smallest of margins. "We've come up with something," he said. "We're going to seal the Kyuubi." As soon as the words left his mouth, the clan heads erupted. Kakashi inwardly shook his head at their inane questions. Could he actually do that? Wasn't there a better way? If it failed, then what? The Yondaime cut loudly through their voices. In Suna, the Ichibi Shukaku was sealed into a teakettle, so we're going to use a similar object. I will need volunteers to hold the Kyuubi off long enough for me to complete the sealing. We should be able to intercept it before it even reaches the village, but we need to leave now. Silence followed his words. Then, most of the Anbu stepped forward. Most of the clan heads did not. If Minato was disappointed, he didn't show it. Instead, he thanked them all, then excused himself in order to make further preparations with Jiraiya. As the Yondaime returned to the tower, the Sandaime took his place to give the volunteers instructions. Kakashi had never seen Sarutobi look so old and troubled. He could count every lineage had pressed upon the man's features, brought into stark contrast by the early morning half-light. Sarutobi took out his pipe, filled it carefully, and lit it, slowly puffing away as he regarded the lot of them. "Listen carefully, because I only have time to go over this once. Once he gets within range, it will take the Hokage 5 minutes to complete the sealing ritual. During this time, you have to keep the Kyuubi's attention. You will have Jiraiya's assistance in this, but it will not be easy." Kakashi inwardly frowned at these words and asked, "You won't be going with us, Sarutobi-sama?" "No, I must assist the Hokage in the ritual," the Sandaime replied. Though his expression was neutral, something in his dark eyes glittered sharply. "I will tell the Hokage that we are ready. Meet at the gate in 10 minutes. With that, he vanished into a cloud of smoke. 10 minutes, Kakashi thought. 10 minutes before everything changes again. He was seized with a sudden, selfish desire to speak to his sensei, perhaps for the last time. The old Kakashi would have crushed such a feeling under the heavy weight of rules and regulations, but it only took the present Kakashi a few seconds to reach the Hokage's window. Once there he hesitated slightly, unsure if interrupting the Yondaime right now was really the smartest thing to do, and then stopped altogether when he heard muffled voices. Shamelessly, the Junin peered through the window. His sensei and Sarutobi were in the office, but they weren't alone. The elders, Homura, Utatane, and Danzo, were with them. They were clearly arguing about something, but they spoke too quietly for him to hear. None of this really surprised Kakashi, who knew that, since day one of him taking office, the elders had made several strong suggestions to his sensei about his role as Hokage, all of which the Yondaime had blatantly ignored. The strange thing was that the Hokage stayed mostly silent throughout this exchange, and Sarutobi seemed to be the one doing the arguing. The Sandaime had always kept his old teammates' advice in consideration during his tenure in office, and often urged his successor to do the same. Now his stance had inexplicably reversed itself. Kakashi had no idea what they were arguing about, only that it was probably pointless and a shameful waste of the precious time they had before the Kyuubi came within distance of Konoha. The Yondaime seemed to think so too, because within the next minute, he had kicked out all 4 of them before relocating to his desk. The blonde sighed raggedly and ran both hands through his shaggy hair. Finally, he turned to the window and said, "You can come in now." Not having the decency to look at all guilty, Kakashi swung deftly into the office. "Yo, come to say your goodbyes?" The Junin looked away. "I wish I didn't have to. You won't reconsider, I guess?" Minato replied flatly, "You know it's my responsibility to protect this village. Konoha's well-being has always come before my own. And before that of Kushina's and Naruto's?" It was a cheap shot, but somehow Kakashi felt obligated to bring it up. The Yondaime smiled without humor. "Jiraiya and Sarutobi have already taken that approach, so I'm afraid that it's not going to work. I'm determined to go through with this." Then his expression softened a bit, and he began to say, "Can I ask you to?" "Of course I'll look after them, sensei," Kakashi said, surprising himself with his own vehemence. "Thank you Kakashi," Minato said. A breeze picked up from the open window, sweeping fine particulates of ash into the office. The Hokage frowned as he looked out to the horizon. The sunrise was blood-red against the sky. "I think we'd better get going." The battle with Kyuubi passed by in one long, chaotic blur. No jutsu could stop the great beast, which had razed the earth and burned the forest barely a mile away from Konoha itself. But somehow, the Konoha nin had managed to keep it from their village, though they paid for it with their lives. Afterwards, Kakashi could only think of finding his sensei. Sarutobi and the Yondaime had separated from the main force early on, and Kakashi had lost sight of them ever since. Even when the Kyuubi's corporeal form had been sucked away by some unseen force, he had not been able to locate the source of the sealing. Although he was half dead with exhaustion, Kakashi pushed himself to stagger around in search of a goat-masked Danbu. Fortunately, Goat was still alive and mostly intact. He had been luckier than most, and was helping ferry the injured onto stretchers to be taken back to the village. He turned when Kakashi approached and pushed his mask to the side, uncovering pale eyes surrounded by bulging veins. "Way ahead of you, Senpai," he said, and began to scan the battlefield with his activated Byakugan. After a few minutes, he deactivated his bloodline limit and looked back at Kakashi. Trying hard to smother his anxiety and failing, the Junin asked, "Did you find him?" "Hyuga Daiki," aka, Goat, held up a hand. Hear me out entirely first, okay senpai? Yes, the Hokage is alive, but he's not moving, probably unconscious. He's about 100 meters that way, by the small outcropping. Sarutobi-sama is lying approximately 300 meters west of him. Uzumaki Kushina is with him. Another Anbu, overhearing this exchange, blurted out, "That red-haired bitch is dead?" At least one good thing came of the Kyuubi. Immediately Kakashi rounded upon him, furious, but Daiki stepped between them. "Senpai," he said quietly, "there's no time for this. I'll have your rank for that." The copy nin snarled before allowing Daiki to lead him away. They searched for the Yondaime first. This decision left Kakashi with some feeling of guilt, especially in light of the promise he'd recently made, but Anbu was Anbu, and his first duty was to look after the Hokage. They found Minato out cold and lying spread-eagled on the ground. Kakashi quickly knelt down to check his pulse. "He's alive," he confirmed a moment later to Daiki. The Hyuga couldn't help but smile in relief. "I'll call for backup. We'll get him back to Konoha in no time." Kakashi nodded and placed his hand on the ground in order to stand up. But instead of grass, he touched something cool and rough and looked down in surprise. Lying by the Hokage's left hand was a small fox statue, carved from rough gray stone. Daiki breathed sharply. "Is that what I think it is?" Cautiously, Kakashi closed his fingers around the statue, lifted it up to eye level. It seemed harmless, ordinary stone. There was no chakra presence, nothing unusual about it. For a moment, the Junin found himself wondering if his sensei had actually succeeded in sealing the Kyuubi. Then, without thinking, he sent a pulse of his own chakra into the stone. A horrifyingly sinister wave of chakra seeped out of the stone, sending waves of cold through both Konoha and Nen. Kakashi dropped the statue as it was suddenly engulfed in blood-red flame. The grass around it caught on fire. Daiki quickly stamped it out before it could reach the Yondaime's prone form. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the chakra presence withdrew, and the thing at their feet was an ordinary statue once more. "Well," Daiki said, after a rather pregnant pause, "I think that answers my question." "What should we do with it, senpai?" "I'll take it," Kakashi said grimly. "This is not something we can leave lying around." Gingerly, he picked up the statue once more and stuck it into his vest. By then, other Anbu had arrived to take the Hokage back to the village. Though he was loath to let Minato out of his sight, Kakashi turned back to the Hyuga and said, "Let's go find the Sandaime and Uzumaki-san." "Way ahead of you, senpai." With a quick display of hand seals, Daiki once again activated his Byakugan, scanning the area to their left. "What the fuck?" he exclaimed suddenly. "Who the fuck are they? What is it?" Kakashi demanded, but Daiki was already on the move. "Damn it," the Junin said to himself, having no choice but to follow suit. But whoever it was that Daiki saw, they were long gone by the time the two arrived on the scene. And so was the life from both of the crumpled forms lying before them. "Oh no," Daiki breathed, covering his mouth as they approached. For an ANBU, the young Hyuga was surprisingly sensitive, but Kakashi hardly had the heart to censure him over it. He could only think of Minato now, and of how thoroughly he'd failed him. Kakashi bent down to check Sarutobi over. He was indeed dead, but the Junin was taken aback by the old man's expression, one of calm tranquility, even as his lips and chin were wet with blood. The body was still warm. If only they'd gotten here sooner, 3 lives had been lost by his hands today. "Senpai, over here." Daiki's shouting broke him out of his thoughts. The Hyuga was kneeling next to Uzumaki Kushina. There was something in his arms. "Wow," Naruto said flatly. "Lucky you found me." Kakashi didn't respond, only drained the rest of his beer and thought about ordering another. So the Kyuubi was sealed in that statue. It's hard to confirm something like that. But I've never seen chakra of that color, or potency, before or since. Naruto frowned. "Didn't you see the end of my fight with the Shukaku?" "No, I was out cold by then." "Was its chakra like that too?" Not exactly. Did you ever catch the guys that Hyuga saw?" The abrupt change in subject did not escape Kakashi's attention, but he decided to let it pass. Daiki couldn't tell who they were, and we never found any traces of them at the scene. Sometimes he wonders if he even saw them. According to the medic Nin who looked her over, your mother died in childbirth. And the Sandaime? A shrug. No one really knows what happened. Officially, the cause was illness. You know that, but that's not the truth. Again, the Junin said nothing. Naruto looked away in disgust and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. Naruto's eyes narrowed into blue slits. Don't tell me you haven't thought the same thing. The argument with the elders. Those people Daiki saw. The Sandaime sealed the Kyuubi, and Danzo got there first, erased all evidence of it. And now he holds that over my goddamn father's head whenever the bastard finally decides to act like he's got a spine. Do not insult the Yondaime in front of me. Kakashi roared, completely losing it and making the other patrons at the ramen-ya stare at him in surprise. Suddenly the Junin felt overwhelmed and increasingly light-headed, to the point where he thought he might faint. Naruto, he said, realizing too late, what did you put in my food? Your beer, actually, his student said, pulling out his wallet and setting a few bills on the counter. While you were in the bathroom. Sakura will be here any second now, so I'm booking. I don't know if she'll take you back to the hospital or not, but hey, at least the meal's on me. Later, Kakashi-sensei. The Junin, his vision already darkening, didn't even manage to see his student leave before he passed out. Tamari swore as she dropped her keys. Shifting the paper bag cradled in her left arm up a bit, she bent down and groped around for them, unable to see the ground thanks to the groceries she was carrying. By the time she had found them and somehow managed to get the right one into the lock, a steady stream of curses was flowing fluidly from her mouth. She was just in the middle of a particularly offensive series of portmanteaus, shitits, assfucker, etc., when the door opened and she stumbled inside to see Uchiha Sasuke and her little brother sitting across from each other at the kitchen table and staring at her. They had the same stare, it was like Gaara ×2, which almost made her drop the groceries. Then she remembered that she was Tamari and scowled. What the hell are you guys looking at? Gaara turned back to their guest and shrugged, as if in apology. My sister. Are all Uchihas this eloquent? Tamari said, rolling her eyes as she put the groceries away. You guys want anything to drink? Made a pot of coffee already, Gaara said. You can have some if you want. To no one's surprise, Sasuke ignored her entirely. Instead, he asked Gaara, why did you call me here? The man who attacked me, you recognized something about him. Who is he? Sasuke's lips thinned into a flat line. His eyes were hard as coals. And why should I tell you? Well, this is awkward, Tamari thought as she watched the scene. The coffee maker gave a little click to indicate that it was done brewing, so she took 2 mugs out of the cupboards and filled them, all the while keeping an eye on Sasuke. If the Uchiha made even the slightest motion of hostility toward Gaara, he would immediately find himself with a kunai up the ass, compliments of his One-ichan. I apologize if I'm imposing, Gaara replied placidly, but it's proving difficult to recover my attacker's body. There was a slight setback when your Junin sensei had descended to an alternate dimension in order to prevent you from using Amaterasu on my village. Sasuke's expression darkened. Are you implying that it's my fault that? Yes, Gaara said, I am implying that your lack of self-control has cost both of our villages important information. Now, we can either settle this diplomatically, or I can beat the answer out of you. Sharingan or no, I think you'll find it difficult to set sand on fire. The Uchiha made no response, so Tamari took the opportunity to ask, milk, Gaara? Yes, please. Thank you, her little brother said as she set the mug before him. He said that his name was Deidara. He's a part of an organization called Akatsuki, Sasuke said suddenly. Tamari snorted to herself. Maybe the boy didn't like to be ignored. They're a group made up of S-class missing nin from all over the elemental countries. They mostly act as mercenaries, but lately there's been the rumor that they're on the lookout for the Biju. Putting 2 and 2 together, Gaara said, your brother's one of them. Sasuke nodded. I swore to kill that man, and I won't let anyone get in my way. You said that they're looking for Biju? Do you know what their intentions are? Tamari asked. No, like I said, it's just a rumor. Most of this information is from one of the Sannin. As far as I know, Deidara could have been acting on another village's orders. And attack Gaara, who just happens to be the Jinchuriki of the Ichibi? That's too convenient to be a coincidence. How many people are in this Akatsuki? Gaara asked. I don't know, but it seems like everyone in it has a partner. Does that mean there's another one of them still in Suna? Tamari said, alarmed. Gaara turned to the window. Outside, the streets bustled with activity as the villagers made repairs to the homes Shukaku had destroyed. If he's out there, the case cage said, surprising the others with his vehemence, then I'll find him.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.